Imagine walking into your childhood home expecting silence, only to hear whispers of comfort, the soft hum of a lullaby, and the rustle of someone caring for your frail mother. Now imagine that person isn't a nurse you hired, nor a relative you expected, but a stranger. And not just any stranger, but a black woman society had overlooked, dismissed, and even ridiculed. Yet here she was, protecting, feeding, and defending a millionaire's mother with Alzheimer's as if she were her own family. What no one knew was that this moment, this simple act of kindness, would unravel secrets, expose prejudice, and change the millionaire's life forever. Because sometimes the people we least expect are the very ones who show us what true love, sacrifice, and humanity really mean. The story begins with a man named Charles Whitman, a self-made millionaire, known in his city for sharp business moves and an even sharper reputation. To the world, he was untouchable. Polished suits, fast cars, and a mansion on the hill that seemed to sparkle above everyone else's lives. But behind that grand facade, there was a pain he couldn't mask. His mother, Eleanor, was fading away. Once a strong and graceful woman who had raised him alone, she now battled Alzheimer's, often forgetting her own name, her own home, and even her only son. Charles did what he thought every wealthy man should do. He hired the best, private nurses, specialists, and caretakers who came with framed degrees and spotless resumes. But one after another, they left. Some grew frustrated, others indifferent. And Eleanor, in her confusion, grew restless and afraid. The mansion's endless rooms echoed with loneliness, and Charles, despite all his fortune, felt powerless to protect the woman who had once protected him. One day he returned home after a long business trip expecting more of the same, emptiness. Instead, he was struck by an unfamiliar sight. In the garden, under the golden shade of an oak tree, his mother sat smiling, her frail hands being held by a woman Charles had never seen before. The stranger had deep brown skin, kind but tired eyes, and a presence that radiated patience. She was not in a polished uniform like the others. Her clothes were simple, practical, worn from work. Yet Eleanor, who barely trusted anyone anymore, leaned against her as if she had known her forever. It was in that moment that Charles realized someone new had stepped into their lives, someone unexpected, and everything was about to change. From the moment Charles saw that woman in the garden, something stirred inside him. At first it wasn't trust, it was suspicion. He was a man used to control, and nothing in his world happened without his approval. Who was this woman? How did she get into his home? Why was his mother, who barely tolerated the presence of trained professionals, suddenly so calm in her company? When Charles asked the house staff, their answers were vague. The regular nurse had quit abruptly a week earlier, leaving the family in a state of chaos. In desperation, the housekeeper had reached out to a recommendation from a neighbor. That was how Ruth Daniels, a middle-aged black woman who had worked quietly as a caregiver for decades, had come to the mansion. At first glance, Charles didn't want to believe she belonged there. His mother's care had always been entrusted to polished, high-paid specialists who charged thousands per week. Ruth didn't look the part. She wasn't armed with degrees or medical certificates framed in glass. She didn't walk with the cold detachment of someone doing their job. Instead, she was gentle, deliberate, and carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who knew suffering, yet refused to let it harden her. Still, Charles resisted. The sharp businessman in him whispered doubts. Could he trust her? Was she competent? Or worse, was she taking advantage of his mother's vulnerability? He even noticed some of his wealthy friends raising their eyebrows when they visited. To them, Ruth was invisible at best, out of place at worst. Some muttered things he didn't want to repeat, words loaded with the prejudice they barely tried to hide. But no matter how much Charles doubted, the evidence kept unfolding before his eyes. His mother, who had spent months in confusion and fear, was suddenly eating better. She laughed softly at memories that Ruth gently coaxed out of her with patience. When Eleanor would wake in the middle of the night frightened and disoriented, it wasn't Charles or the doctors who could calm her. It was Ruth's steady voice. her reassuring hand, her presence. Days turned into weeks, and Charles couldn't ignore the shift. His mother was still ill, yes. Alzheimer's had no cure. But there was light in her eyes again, fleeting moments of recognition, glimpses of the woman she had been. Ruth's methods were not clinical, they were human. She would sing softly when Eleanor was restless. She would bring her into the garden to feel the sun, rather than confining her in sterile rooms. She treated her not as a patient, but as a person who still mattered, yet beneath the surface tension simmered. Charles's pride warred with his gratitude. How could someone he had underestimated, someone society often overlooked, succeed where the best professionals had failed? And more than that, why did Ruth seem to understand his mother in ways even he, her only child, could not? One evening, Charles overheard a conversation that left him shaken. Ruth was speaking quietly to Eleanor, who had mistaken her for a childhood friend. Instead of correcting her, Ruth leaned into the memory, asking about her past, letting her live in that familiar moment. Eleanor's face lit up as she recounted her stories, her voice trembling with life. Charles stood in the hallway watching, realizing that what Ruth offered wasn't just care, it was dignity, but not everyone approved. Behind Charles's back, whispers spread through his social circle. Some suggested Ruth was only there to secure a place in his mother's will. Others scoffed that he was being irresponsible, trusting a stranger with something so precious. A few even let their racism bleed into their words, suggesting she was beneath the position. Each time, Charles felt anger rise in his chest, but he didn't know how to respond. He wanted to believe in Ruth, yet the world around him questioned her worth. The pressure mounted, and soon Charles found himself at a crossroads. Would he let his prejudice and the judgment of others cloud his decision? Or would he open his eyes to the truth, that sometimes the people who appear the least likely to save us are the very ones we need most? The answer was coming, and when it arrived, it would shake everything he thought he knew. The breaking point came one stormy evening. The rain lashed against the mansion windows, the kind of night that carried an unsettling weight. Charles had just returned from a tense business dinner, still carrying the sting of whispered judgments from his so-called friends. One of them had gone so far as to say, "You're letting your mother's legacy be handled by someone who doesn't belong." The words cut deep, not because Charles believed them, but because part of him feared they might be true. When he entered the house, the scene stopped him cold. His mother was in distress, pacing the room, confused and panicked. She was shouting names from the past, calling for people long gone. Normally, moments like these spiraled into hours of torment. But before Charles could intervene, Ruth stepped forward. She didn't rush. She didn't force. She simply reached for Eleanor's trembling hands, guiding her gently back to the chair. Charles stood frozen as Ruth began to hum. A tune so soft, so deliberate, it seemed to weave through the chaos like a thread of light. Slowly, Eleanor's breathing calmed. Her shoulders relaxed. And then something happened that Charles never thought he would witness again. His mother looked up, her eyes locking onto his. For the first time in months, maybe years, true recognition flickered in her gaze. "Charles," she whispered, not in confusion, not mistaking him for someone else. She knew him. Tears welled in his eyes as he stumbled closer, kneeling beside her. It was fleeting, only a few seconds before the fog returned. But those seconds were priceless. They were a gift, carved out of the darkness by Ruth's patience, her care, her unwavering presence. And in that moment, Charles finally saw the truth. All his doubts, all the prejudice, all the voices telling him she didn't belong, it was all a lie. Ruth was not just a caregiver, she was a lifeline. She had given him back something that money, power, and privilege could never buy. She had given him back his mother. But as the weight of the moment settled, Charles also realized the uglier truth. The world outside this mansion would never see Ruth the way he now did. They would see her race before they saw her humanity. They would measure her worth by the wrong scales. And yet none of that mattered anymore. Because in this house, in this family, Ruth had proven something undeniable. Sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones society refuses to recognize. The storm raged on outside, but inside something shifted forever. The days that followed carried a quiet transformation. Charles was no longer the man who had looked at Ruth through the narrow lens of society's prejudice. Instead, he became a witness to her strength, her dignity, and her devotion, not just to Eleanor, but to the very idea of humanity itself. Every morning he watched her greet Eleanor with patience, even when the disease stole away names, faces, and moments. Every night he saw her sit beside Eleanor's bed, whispering comfort into the shadows of confusion. Ruth had become more than a caregiver. She was the guardian of his mother's last fragments of self. And Charles couldn't ignore it any longer. This woman, this black nanny the world might dismiss, was the very reason his mother still had pieces of herself left to hold on to. But the world outside the mansion hadn't changed. At dinner parties, whispers still circled. Why not hire someone more appropriate? Why trust so much to her? These words dripped with the venom of centuries-old prejudice, reminders that even in wealth, privilege, and luxury, racism had its claws dug deep into society's skin. Yet Charles, once silent in the face of such comments, no longer stayed quiet. For the first time, he stood up. He defended Ruth not with anger but with truth. He told them what he had seen, a woman who had done the impossible, who had restored fragments of love and memory where science and money had failed. And slowly, the whispers began to fade, not because prejudice had vanished, but because Charles himself had changed. His voice, once complicit in silence, now carried weight. And in standing for Ruth, he began to dismantle the prejudice within himself and those around him. For Ruth, none of this was about recognition or validation. She didn't seek praise, and she never asked for thanks. Her strength came from something deeper, the understanding that dignity is not defined by wealth, race, or social status. It is defined by compassion, by the willingness to see someone's humanity even when the world insists on looking away. Eleanor's moments of clarity grew fewer and farther between, but each time they appeared, Charles knew who to thank. And in those moments, Ruth's presence became a quiet, undeniable reminder. Sometimes the people society undervalues are the ones who carry the greatest power to heal. When Eleanor eventually passed, it was Ruth who held her hand, whispering the same hymn she had sung that stormy night. Her voice didn't tremble because Ruth understood something Charles only then began to grasp. Death wasn't the end of dignity. It was the final chapter, and she had ensured Eleanor's was written with compassion, not fear. At the funeral, many expected Ruth to sit quietly at the back. Instead, Charles brought her to the front row beside him. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, unable to reconcile their ideas of class and race with what they saw. But Charles didn't care anymore. This was where Ruth belonged, at the heart of the family she had held together. And when the service ended, Charles spoke words that would linger long after the mourners left. He said, "Wealth can build mansions, but it cannot buy humanity. And humanity, I found it in Ruth." The truth of those words struck deeper than any inheritance, any business empire, or any legacy, because in the end, this was not a story about a millionaire or his fortune. It was not a story about power or privilege. It was a story about the courage it takes to see past the labels the world imposes. It was about the injustice of racism, yes, but also about the possibility of change, the way one person's compassion can shatter prejudice and remind us what truly matters. And as the video closes, I leave you with this. How many heroes have we overlooked because of the color of their skin? How many lives have been diminished, ignored, or dismissed simply because society refuses to see their worth? Maybe it's time we ask ourselves, not what divides us, but what unites us. Because sometimes the people we least expect are the ones who can save us in ways we never imagined.